Head Over Heels is one of the absolute classics of the late 80s isometric puzzle platformer genre. A genre which never really progressed all that much beyond the late 80s. Indeed, I would argue it's the classic, the best of the genre, but then I do have a bit of a bias here. It was one of very, very few games that you could get for the computer my family had at the time, the Amstrad PCW8256, the very one you're looking at right now, so I played a lot of Head Over Heels back in the day. And now it's 2025, and there's a new one, or a remake, or an expansion. This one's a bit of an oddity, because while there's been a version of Head Over Heels available for Steam for some time now, the retrospect version, that one's very much just a classic play it as it is kind of game. This one expands on Head Over Heels with a whole bunch of new rooms and a couple of little quirks that make it a much bigger, much more interesting game, honestly. But maybe you've never played Head Over Heels before. What's it all about? Head Over Heels is itself, well, a terrible pun really. You play as Head and Heels. Head and Heels are these two dog-like creatures, and Head can jump much higher and has a donut gun that can temporarily stun enemies, at least stun them for as long as you're in each single screen room, while Heels runs much faster but jumps much shorter distances, but eventually ends up with a bag that can help him carry a single item within a room to help build towers and reach objectives. So it is split between that mix of platforming, just those rooms where you go, right, well, I jump from here to here to here, and lining it all up. Not as easy as it looks, because the isometric perspective can play tricks on your eyes, and of course, there's the fact that the characters themselves, for example, do not have jump shadows to them. So you've got to keep an eye on where you are at all times. And then the more puzzly elements of, right, well, how do I get to there? Or how do I get to there through several rooms? Some of the things get quite complicated later on. Now, the two heroes start up the game split up, but eventually they can join up. That's when they become Head Over Heels with both of their powers combined. But through the game's levels, where you're tasked with finding a series of crowns, including an all-new one, you get split up again, because that way you can play with the different mechanics in different ways, and also because there are teddy bears that don't like Head. It's not really worth going into the plot. The plot was quite silly back in the day, and it still is. And it's really clear that the developers here really love Head Over Heels. They've done a spectacular job in a lot of respects with the source material while expanding on it, because this is a bigger game than Head Over Heels originally was, with a whole host of new rooms to conquer and chickens to find. Yes, chickens. You're not just finding crowns, you're finding chickens. 32 of them in all. And these are split off from the regular rooms. It's pretty much as soon as you start out. If you're familiar with classic Head Over Heels, you go, hang on, there's never a door there. And that'll lead to a corridor, which will then lead to another room with a challenge to work out how to get to each chicken. Now, in one sense, they are just collectibles, but also you can use them to trade for extra lives, which you will need, because this is a classic old-school hard game. It will very happily kill you en masse, which is why you do start with more than your kind of classic 3 lives. 3 lives would be a tough ask to get through this particular game. They've also made a few interesting tweaks here, some for the better, some for the worse. So the default normal speed, for example, is faster than classic Head Over Heels. There is a classic setting, and I'm going to recommend, if you've never played Head Over Heels, or even if you just haven't played it for a long while, go for the classic speed setting, because it's the proper difficulty, and it's still plenty hard, don't worry about that. The faster speed settings do let you move quicker. Technically, the game would be over faster, I suppose, but they really do up the difficulty level. You've got so much less of a margin for error. But speaking of margin for error, there's also difficulty settings, and classically this might just involve, well, we'll just chuck you a whole bunch of extra lives. And while you do get a few more extra lives in the easy mode, what's really interesting here is they've actually redesigned some of the rooms. So some of the threats are smaller, or there'll be fewer enemies, or there'll be a couple of extra platforms in a given room. And that's a really interesting step that just shows that they really do understand what makes this game tick, because they're making it more accessible to more people. Now, that being said, this is a big, big game, 500 plus rooms to get through, although some of them are just corridors that you go through. There's no exploring to be done there, you just got to find them. So it'll take you some time to get through it. And that might not appeal to everyone, given the pace is still somewhat sedate. I should also note that at launch, it's meant to include Steam Cloud Save. So I've played the Steam version. There's apparently a Switch version coming later in the year if all goes well. But at launch, Steam Cloud Saves don't actually work like they're meant to. So in the game, you collect these fish. And these were always here. This is not a new invention. You collect these fish, and they allow you to then restart from that point. You can use those in the game, and in fact, you can use any fish you've created. So you can restart from earlier or later in the game, and that respects the number of lives you had. So that is actually more important just than how far I've actually got in the game. But those are only permanent for as long as you're running the game. As soon as you close out, at the moment, it does not respect that. Now, looking at the Steam forums for this game, the developers are aware of this. They're apparently working on a patch to make that work properly. They're also promising more classic visual modes, which, honestly, I wouldn't mind coming from that PCW background. I'd love to see a green screen mode, but maybe that's a bit too wishlisty. But overall, this is a really good version of this game. I'd say, yes, it's definitely better than the retrospect version, which is still up there. Don't ask me how the rights on those two work, because I have no idea whatsoever. But this is a really good game. If you have fond memories of this is a good way to revisit them on a modern system with a few more tweaks. If you absolutely nailed this game back in the day, and being one of the very few games that I had, I absolutely did, it's great to explore the new sections and become familiar with a venerated classic all over again.